experience becomes really important because people are putting this effort in to drive over and they're making the decision. Convenience is a really big factor when you're shopping in stores. Generally, people that have recently looked at abstract art or gone through the experience will see the world in a different way. And we measure that by even seeing like how they see themselves positioned to the rest of the world. We ask them to draw. It's a really interesting thing because it promotes some pro-environmental behaviors. It shapes how you think about yourself and your actions onto the world. There's a lot of different behaviors, and especially in grocery, as consumers, we're learning. And I think as retailers, we're in this feedback cycle. Okay, let me try to see how you build a basket online.
Welcome to the Curiosity Current, the podcast where we dive deep into what's shaping today's trends and tomorrow's consumers. I'm your host, Stephanie, and I'm so glad you're joining me. Each episode, we tap into the minds of researchers, innovators, and insights professionals to explore how curiosity drives discovery and how discovery drives better decisions in an ever-changing market landscape. Whether you're a data enthusiast, a strategy pro, or like me, just endlessly fascinated by human behavior, this is the place for you. So get ready to challenge your assumptions, spark some fresh thinking, and have some fun along the way. Let's see where curiosity takes us next with this brand new episode. Welcome back to the Curiosity Current, a market research podcast by AYTM. Today, I'm joined on the hosting side by Julie Meyer, Senior Insights Analyst on AYTM's product team. Julie, thanks so much for joining.
My pleasure.
Both Julie and I are behavioral scientists. We are social psychologists by training, and that's why I thought it would be great to have Julie as an interview partner for today's guests. So let's introduce that guest. Dr. Hassan Aleem is a senior consumer insights partner at Amazon, where he focuses on leveraging behavioral science and neuroscience to uncover deep consumer insights that drive business strategy. Hassan's experience spans across consumer psychology, UX research, and neuroaesthetics, with the unifying goal of creating meaningful, data-informed experiences.
Before joining Amazon, Hassan was a behavioral science consultant for Nuance Behavior, working with clients to build neuroscience-informed products, and a UX researcher at Creative Science. His academic journey includes pioneering work in neuroaesthetics and sensory substitution at Georgetown University, where he explored how the brain processes beauty and sensory experiences.
In this episode, we'll explore the challenges and opportunities of measuring consumer sentiments and behaviors in grocery contexts, and how behavioral science can help us understand the subconscious drivers behind decision-making. Hassan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. So excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. To get us started, and this is a question I really like to hear from all of our guests. Your career obviously blends, cutting-edge behavioral science and neuroscience with consumer insights, and you've worked on everything from UX research to neuroaesthetics. Do you mind just kind of walking us through how you got to where you are in your career? Like, what is the origin story of Hassan Aleem?
Yeah, and I've listened to past episodes. I've appreciated that you've asked this question to everybody because it's really interesting to see that by journey.
It's so fun, yeah.
Yeah, so my journey started in academia, but I even going into it, like Julie mentioned, I completed my dissertation in neuroaesthetics, but that necessarily wasn't what I knew I was going to go ahead in academia to do. But it just became a really interesting question because I was really interested in preferences, and I was really interested in this broader concept of going beyond more easy to understand processes and looking at from these esoteric questions like beauty and art, which have been generally out of the grasp of psychology and especially out of the grasp of neuroscience. But at that time, neuroaesthetics was kind of coming into field. So it became really interesting to me. And as I was completing that, I overlapped with marketing became really apparent. In one of the last studies I concluded, I looked at marketing literature, business school literature, to try and understand what have other people measured and how people's coverages change over time, how they're developed, how can you learn some of those methodologies. So it was kind of like a natural pathway to, well, I'm exploring this really esoteric topics, but now these are actually things that marketers and business schools, et cetera, are really interested in. And aside from that, I think I always kind of knew that academia wasn't going to be as much as I enjoyed the learning process, and I see myself as a continuing learner. wasn't going to be where I wanted to be. I wanted to be very much in an applied setting. I wanted to a little bit more into the messiness of the real world. So after wrapping up, I ended up doing consulting with digital health, and that kind of got me into this space of like working the digital experiences. And many times, neuroscience is relevant there, but most of the times they're kind of basing a lot of your insights and your thoughts from like fundamental first principle things that you learn about psychology and cognitive science. And that kind of continues to be the thread that, helps me throughout this day working in the grocery retail space. And that jump, I think I guess the third sort of significant jump is going within industry from like this very digital world, working with apps, working with digital experiences, working with websites and UX to grocery and retail, which is very, very physical. I had always been really interested in, I'm one of those people that likes to go to the grocery store. I notice when there are certain promotions happening, I notice how things are organized, and I've always been like, well, I think that was maybe one of my first even insights to myself of like, okay, maybe I should explore psychology, etc. So when this opportunity came about, I was really excited because, also just thinking about it in terms of like grocery is such a fascinating, and I'm sure we'll get into the nitty-gritty of it, right? Such a fascinating space because food is a decision that we make every single day, multiple times a day. But it's also habitual. There's some social factors. It's so incredibly rich. When you think about, zooming out them like what's on our smartphone versus what we have to shop and eat every day and put in our bodies, it's such a richer space. It's been really, really interesting learning so many things and so many open questions that dig me into now.
Totally. That makes so much sense. And I have to say, like, when I was thinking about like what it is that you study, and especially in the context of subconscious drivers of behavior, that the grocery store is one of those contexts where it's so easy to see the impact of subconscious drivers, because I go to the grocery store with intention always. I know I'm not just there for fun. I always go with a plan, but it never turns out the way, it's never aligned with the intentions. There are so many things that happen that were not planned for the cart to have in it. And so it really does bring to life the way that subconscious stimuli and drivers and even processes within your own mind totally impact what happens in that store. So fascinating context. Yeah.
So going off of that in terms of what that grocery store context is really unique in being able to understand consumer behavior, what do you see as the biggest challenges in accurately capturing those fluctuating consumer sentiments in such a dynamic setting?
Yeah, well, like you said, what makes it really exciting and interesting is what it also makes it really hard to measure and tell apart. One of like the real physical challenges is that it is a physical space. We can't really easily do A/B testing. And I think that's a fundamental challenge that when you're looking at iteration, coming from a UX space and app design, et cetera, like you can kind of come up with a lot of Figma designs. You can really kind of iterate, get really rapid prototypes and feedback. Even getting a rapid prototype out there for a physical grocery space, not only are you like that's costly, but you're also disrupting real behavior because there's no kind of retail space setting generally that you can go into and kind of try things out. So you have to kind of weigh the risks of testing in a real store because, at the end of the day, like you're disrupting people's behaviors and people have loyalty that they repeat, you're wanting to come back. So there is that. I think that's the fundamental issue is that you're dealing with a physical space and testing control become difficult, and there's different markets and regional differences that come about. So, and those are much more apparent in a physical retail space than they would be for an average user. You can kind of look at, open up Instagram and kind of, sure, there's differences, but you can kind of think of it as like, okay, let's look at the global user and test this worldwide. But for something like grocery, sometimes you really have to hone in on cultural differences that come about with specific regions.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to kind of talk a little bit about the methodologies that you use. Over the past 10 or 15 years, neuroscience, behavioral science are obviously increasingly being used to better understand consumer behavior, often through, uncovering and measuring the subconscious drivers of behavior. I think Julie and I have probably both kind of followed this with some interest, having come from the backgrounds ourselves where, we were studying these same things. But how can these fields that obviously got their start in like basic science and basic research, help us understand behavior in these applied settings of in-store shopping and purchase behavior. Like, how do you do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. And a lot of times you have to think about proxies of behavior. And so one of the nice things with grocery store purchase behavior is that you can actually look at outcome metrics and look at, purchase rates. You can look at return rates and how often people are buying. You can look at baskets and basket sizes and basket composition. So those are some really interesting things that kind of tell you about to help you do segmentation and try to basically look at the person that is coming in. Can we classify them as somebody who is just, doing a few things, shopping up for topping up their basket, or are they actually coming there for their full grocery shop? What are the most common co-located items that they put in their grocery in their cart when they actually shop something? So there's a lot of interesting outcomes of behaviors that you can look at to see, we made a change in a display or an end cap in a grocery store for a specific type of pasta, for example, did that actually lead to more people buying it? So that's, I think, the best kind of corollary for behavior. But aside from that, we also do try to look at feedback surveys. So generally in a grocery context, people will try to have some sort of customer feedback systems that they've set up. And you might be familiar with this when you go to the store, you see your receipt, and on the bottom it says hey, give us feedback. I think you see that even at fast food restaurants, so many places. That's actually things, if sometimes you might think okay, I'm just tossing that and not looking at it. There's actually a lot of interest in looking at that type of feedback. And of course, you have to think about the selection bias that goes into that for people that are willingly responding. But we take special precautions to make sure that we eliminate that bias as much as we can. But that is a great metric because you can actually look at people's satisfaction and a whole bunch of other aspects that you can ask custom questions there. And then you're able to kind of tie that to actual purchase behavior. So that's where kind of the behavior comes in. You have the receipt data, so you can see this customer bought these items. What are their general perceptions? What did they come in for? Did they see the sign while in the store? So we can kind of ask more topical questions at that time and then kind of tie back behavior based on their actual receipts. So I would say that's probably one of the closest tie. But in addition to that, we also do, there's custom studies that you can go into the store, methodologies that I think in the grocery setting, just like in the household setting, the closer you can get to ethnography, the more fruitful it is because there are, like you said, so many unspoken and implicit shapers of behavior. So a classic methodology is a shop along where you kind of shop along with a customer while they walk through. And just like you would in an online talk out loud method interview, you kind of have the customer shop out loud as they navigate the store, kind of observe and try not to interrupt their natural flow. And you can also do intercepts. So you can kind of get a combination of people that are walking the store, and then you can kind of see immediately people's reactions or thoughts as they had a behavior in the store, and you can kind of ask them as they're walking out, for example, or as they're walking in. So catching them in the right context and tying that to behavior is probably the closest way that we can try to get fundamentally to measure behavior. And just because it's people come into the store for different needs, for different reasons, for a different time. So the better we can get at being in the context with them, the more useful the data is.
Got it. And it sounds like, from everything you said, that you're really marrying up a lot of different kinds of data from ethnography and some survey data, but also transactional data, right? At the end of the day, your outcome metrics are right there in that point of sale data, right?
Absolutely. I think any grocery retailer, you'll see that, that is ultimately the bottom line. And you see that becomes a little harder to connect that bottom line when you're thinking of an online and app world where, we have daily active users. Is that the bottom line? What is our KPIs? I think with the grocery setting, it's just a little easier to say are we getting these purchase rates? Are we getting repeat rates? Are we getting people getting share of wallet? So there's a lot of, I think, inherently the monetary aspect of it is really closely tied. And I think as a behavioral scientist, I think that's a good thing because as much as we do, and I personally also, coming from the world of aesthetics, there's this whole, I do value what people believe as a brand and buy in terms of perceptions and all that stuff. But ultimately, it's where your wallet speaks is what shapes the world. So that definitely is a critical component there.
And then tying that with what Stephanie was saying about basic research into applied, how then can we take all of this different data? How can brands use this data to kind of inform strategies they can take to enhance customer loyalty or other sorts of in-store experiences?
Yeah. So, a lot of this ideally, you're working very closely with the specific teams, various teams at different levels to help formulate that strategy. So, you have different levels of data coming in at the very granular level. Like I mentioned, you're actually in the store with people, but you can also kind of zoom out and look at something like a brand tracking survey where you're kind of looking at what do people think about your brand? Are they aware of it? Let's look at people that are in the trade area within 10 miles of your brand. And are they actually aware that you exist? Are they aware? What do they think about it if they're aware? So you can kind of start from there and work your way down. And then the level of strategic question that comes from different teams that you're working with. For example, if you're working with like a category team that's really interested in, like, hey, we really want to make sure meat is doing well at our stores, then you can kind of look at perceptions both at the broader level, like do people think we have high quality meats? Do they think it's well priced, etc. But then you can also then like shop the store with people and try to understand like, well, why didn't they make this decision? So ultimately, the questions really come down to the applied sense of like, hey, look, we're seeing this in the data. And I think that's where, again, we're kind of data-led and purchase-led to say like, we're not seeing, we tried this marketing campaign or we tried this promotion or we're launching this new brand. And we want to understand, like, are people picking up what we're putting out there? Are people, or what are the invisible barriers that we're not kind of learning about? In addition to that, there's also like pre-rollout, there's, working with teams like that to say like, hey, can we design this packaging better? And I think that's where a lot of like testing comes in at the survey level. So just broadly understanding, but also at the heuristics level to know like, well, the way you design certain packaging is going to influence people's perception a certain way. And how's that roll up? So there's few different ways, but ultimately what it does come down to is we try to tie to the business decision as much as possible and kind of work very closely with that team in the strategy that they're trying to execute all throughout that journey of that strategy.
And then following through from that, you've explored the concept of instability of preferences over time, particularly in your research on aesthetic preferences. How does this type of instability apply to grocery shopping? When brands are thinking about using promotions or seasonal products or new product launches to try to shift preferences or shift that actual buying behavior.
Yeah. So just to give some context, I think generally in psychological research, just because of methodological limitations, you measure people's responses once. At best, you can try to get it twice, or in a lot of like anthropology studies, you can get multiple longitudinal measurements. But especially in aesthetics, traditionally has been like, let's measure once and we kind of label them and say like, hey, people like symmetrical faces, people like this. But I think anecdotally, we can all agree that like our preferences, our design sense, our fashion sense, they've changed dramatically over time. In fact, they change like, day to day, they change based on a new friend that you make when you travel somewhere. So it's clearly, you catching somebody at a specific time with a survey is not giving you the best insight. So that was kind of like the fundamental reason to do that. And that now, thankfully, in distance psychology in general, but in aesthetics as well, like there is more interest to do that. So my goal there was to try to just like show proof that like, hey, look, our preferences do change. And sometimes they change based on choices. And I think that's the key thing that kind of runs true from marketing studies as well. So at that time, like I mentioned, I looked in the marketing literature to see like, hey, is there any marketing work that has looked at preferences changing over time? And similarly, like there was a couple studies there, but not so much. But generally what you see is like there's this really tight interaction between choice and preference. And that makes sense because when you choose something, let's say you have you go to the store and you're like, okay, I haven't seen these two brands before, but I'm going to kind of arbitrarily pick one, but my brain is going to tell me a story that, I actually liked it better for this reason. And then next time you go, anything that, not only that item, but statistically anything that matches the profile of the item is going to stand out and capture more attention. And we know that attention ultimately is what leads to more choice and more consideration. So brands in the store we have the ability to do that by putting an end cap and saying like, hey, we want you to start thinking about functional drinks, right? So we can there's a really interesting thing because like, it's not like we can leave it up to the consumer but you can also see if a competitor is doing something, hey, if a competitor starts really focusing on, like a functional drink that they're putting out there, then that is going to be top of mind. So like maybe we should do that too. And so then it becomes like a trend and people kind of start following that. And I think you generally see that to be like, oh, now like everybody has organic, or now like you see ashwagandha in every drink that you pick up. That wasn't the case before. And did that just happen naturally? No, it was like this cycle of like some consumers were aware of it. They started purchasing it. Some stores said, hey, let's put this up front. That led to more and then led to this virtuous cycle. So it's a really interesting thing, but it's also a little bit kind of like same with recommendation engines. I think, for example, if you have Spotify or Apple Music, there's studies there that show like recommendation shapes your preference and quite strongly. And people kind of discount that because, of course, we want to believe that we're the ones that came up with our preferences and unique humans. So I think there's a responsibility there as well that comes with like, humans are naturally flexible creatures. So we have the ability to kind of help shape that. And can we do that in a direction that we think is ultimately of their benefit?
I have a quick question in the vein you were talking about. So you're talking about when I make a purchase, it starts to solidify the preference for that thing, and that preference can actually extend to related or similar type things too. Did I get that right?
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm thinking about that as almost like cognitive dissonance reduction, right? I bought it, so I must like it, right? What about the other side that always comes up for me in this context, which is the buyer's remorse side? Like, do you know, or do you hypothesize that works in reverse, such that if I purchase and then I have a bad experience, that starts to then, bleed into things that are aesthetically similar, and that I would have a lower preference for those things based on my experience with this thing that did not pan out for me?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And, this kind of goes back to like in neuroaesthetics, the focus generally always has been on like beauty and art, but there's this whole other world of ugly and disgusting, and preferences to what you're speaking to is like, we have both valences in how we respond to the world and how we navigate the world. It's like we like something, and generally that leads to more attention and greater like affordances. We kind of understand it better. Its approach responses go up, but the opposite will happen and should happen for something that, maybe you got at the wrong time and it made you sick. You're just not going to be thinking about that category anymore at all. And if I had to, just based on like the literature that I'm familiar with, like it's probably the stronger response because it's more survivally protective to say like, hey, if this thing got me sick or if this thing didn't make me feel well, like I'm just not going in this area at all. So yes, I think that's a really important risk that you're bringing about is like, in terms of purchase behaviors, like how do we get past that experience where like maybe a customer shopped at that category or that item somewhere else and it just didn't work for them. And now like they're not even going to consider that or anything that kind of represents a similar messaging. So there you have to think about education, etc. But yeah, I would say it's a really strong force that I think oftentimes is overlooked because you're always kind of trying to promote choice, but it's always useful to kind of look at like, well, can we flip that and understand any aversions that people have?
One thing in particular, kind of building on this, that I am really curious about is your work on aesthetic mindset and its impact on abstract versus concrete thinking. Can you explain that concept a little bit and then kind of talk about how grocery brands could use this idea to influence consumer behavior?
Yeah, well, I wish I had like a piece of art right now so I could give you a really abstract answer to a really good question. But I think generally the idea is that putting people in a scanner, you can kind of evoke an aesthetic mindset because you can kind of look at the differences and asking people to evaluate something and say like, hey, what size is this, or is this a square or not? Or you can ask them like tangential questions to the actual aesthetic nature of the stimuli. Or you can say, how beautiful is this? Or how much do you like this? Or like, how much does this move you? And generally we see that like, when you're thinking about that and when you're in that mindset, or generally when you're exposed to art or you look at abstract art, you tend to see the world in a little bit more of an abstract way. And that's behaviorally, like that's been measured by looking at like psychological distancing, which is a way to kind of look at like how you see the world. And generally people that have recently like looked at abstract art or gone through that experience will kind of see the world in a different way. And we measure that by kind of like even seeing like how they see themselves positioned to the rest of the world. We ask them to draw it. So it's a really interesting thing because it promotes some pro-environmental behaviors. It kind of shapes how you think about yourself and your actions onto the world. So I think it's a really interesting aspect that, can be really interesting for grocery retailers that are trying to promote their social good and environmental good personas to kind of get them to sort of think about, hey, look, we're not just a brand that's fulfilling your needs, but we're trying to do better in the world. What you're purchasing here is getting you to think broadly. and, it's having this broad environmental impact. That's why you should pay a little bit more for this, item that's comes from regenerative farming or organic farming or fair trade standards, for example. So there's a lot of interesting ways to promote that. Obviously, it's a little challenging to do that in the store, but I think I haven't yet found a way to, how could you promote that? But generally, you would expect that type of behavior from someone who is viewing abstract art or thinking about art in general, those more aesthetic concepts, is to be just a little bit more pro-environmental, a little bit more considerate, conscientious.
That is so cool. I feel like we should just fill all the grocery stores with abstract art, clearly, right?
Yeah, well, you can. There's fun studies where people put just all they do is put abstract art on their packaging, and it leads people to think it's more premium. And that's the only difference, right? It tastes different, tastes better. You can do a lot of interesting. Taste is such an interesting interaction there. So I know that's kind of one step beyond you've already purchased, but you can definitely really modify taste based on the aesthetics of the packaging and what you put on there. And you see that with the fancier chocolates or anything they really are. It looks like artwork.
Or the sparkly water, yeah, which is just water, right? Well, I have a little bit of a gear switching question. So this relates to omnichannel retail. Do you have thoughts about how we address sort of the challenge of measuring consumer behavior across both physical stores and online platforms as well? And I think in particular, what I'm wondering about is, are there insights from one channel, and I think so far we've been talking about in-store, that can inform strategies even in online retail settings, particularly in the context of groceries?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because generally we see trends in the market of people moving towards, or at least being aware of or trying online grocery retail. I think that's just becoming the logistical network for that is coming more and more online. So it's becoming more possible to do that. That being said, as much as there are overlaps, it's still early days to be able to tell the difference between can we carry over learnings? So online retail has been long a sort of behavior that people have gotten used to. And there's very specific things related to that, the time limited sales, the way that pricing is done, how quickly the pricing changes, how quickly promotions change. That doesn't happen in a grocery store. If you're driving to a grocery store, if you saw, that promotions were changing and this sale was going to end in 3 hours, you would be really upset. But online, we're like, oh, I need to do this. I need to log on before this ends. So there's a lot of different behaviors. And especially in grocery, it's also something that as consumers, we're learning. And I think as retailers, we're kind of in this kind of feedback cycle of hey, let me try to see how you build a basket online. What are you okay with trusting for? Are you going to order your fish and your seafood and your eggs and those types of things online? Or are you going to go into the store? And then generally the experience online, I think, is just not, in terms of the UX, in terms of the CX, is just not as rich as what you see. So I know earlier you were talking about as you shop a store, you end up doing and you end up buying things that you didn't think. Online, we hear from customers that people actually like that experience. That's as much as people they're open to that, right? They're receptive to that. So, but online, it's a little harder to do that just because you don't want so many things. If there's only one 2D screen, you're not kind of walking through a space, you're not looking at two products, you can't pick it up. So just some really, really interesting differences. And then, of course, this whole other world of delivery and the fulfillment person. And this kind of comes to your personal identity, right? So if you're vegan and if you're shopping for your child, maybe you want to get avocados and bananas that are a certain way. But of course, your grocery picker, how do you communicate that to them? So there's some really a distance between people struggle with those types of things. But at the same other end of the spectrum, people are so happy that, if you're disabled, or in general, if you're a time limited parent, or you're working, you're a student, you just get groceries delivered to your footstep. With how overwhelming our world can become, some people just don't like interacting with humans. And I think we can all be like that sometimes. So there's this general option and openness to it, but it's a challenging thing to carry over right now just because it's so developing, I would say, especially in the online world. And then things are merging as well. As that happens, especially with retailers like Amazon and Walmart, which have both online and in-store presences in a very real way. I know every other store does that too, but in a very real way, they have marketplaces. How can you sort of blend in that? Can you sort of bring in information that the online customer really likes, that we know that a customer is opening up their app to look up this product anyway, when they're shopping in the store? Is that going to start to appear? Like, what can we do to bring the best of both experiences? It's still an open question, but a really interesting one.
It really is. And I mean, it sounds like part of the reason why you can't just translate findings from in-store to online is because it's actually quite a different experience.
It is, absolutely.
So Hassan, in grocery retail, we know that differentiation is key, not just through product features, but also through the consumer experience. How can behavioral science help brands better understand how to differentiate their products, of course, but also to create differentiated, tailored experiences that resonate on a psychological level with consumers?
Yeah, I think especially for the in-store channel, I think the experience becomes really important because people are putting this effort in to drive over and they're making the decision. And sometimes, convenience we know is a really big factor when you're shopping in store. So the experience plays a big role. The experience helps shape how premium the store feels, how much warmth there is. But generally, I think it's about understanding your customer at a level of like who is coming through the door. So if there's can we provide not only the experience for you, the buyer, but your family? So can we provide the fruit that's for kids? Can we provide the smaller carts that's for kids? Can we have experiences that make it just a delight? And I think that's where technology can play a big role as well, where, you can kind of interact with different types of technology while you're in the store. And does that make kind of elevate the experience beyond just looking at an aisle? Because I think, I think consumers are burdened with a ton of choices and it can start to sometimes feel like you're buying the same things over and over again. You go to the store. Why do you have to do kind of this labor? Can we make the experience just a little bit nicer and easier for you? Can we provide you just a little bit of more information to make that decision fatigue easier, whether it's through integrating like a digital component or just in store, like making that organization a little bit easier? I know, like if you go to a bookstore, for example, oftentimes they do a really good job of like employees providing their insights into like, why did we pick this, right? And that's really resonating with like, okay, that's something that I can only find here. So grocery stores and other retailer in grocery can kind of learn from that to understand like consumers are faced by choice. They're bombarded with, this is healthy for you. Now, no, wait, it's not. Like if you look up, is coffee good or bad? Like you'll find equal number of things every day, or chocolate, which, I just stopped reading that news because I like chocolate too much. Like, I think it's just that you get overwhelmed and there's these different stimulus. So like as much as you can make that cognitive fatigue of like decision easier, that's the ultimate thing, I think, in terms of experience. But yeah, beyond that, just delighting the customer and not just the customer, like who else is shopping with the customer, making it easy, making carts, just the small things that end up actually shaping why you would return somewhere beyond price. Like, of course, we know that price, especially in this economy, is driving a lot of purchase behaviors. But once you can compete on that, like where are other places we can find dividends? Like experience is definitely the next thing.
I love that example of the employee reviews because it reminds me of, I'm going to mention a competitor. Trader Joe's, I feel like, has always done that. They have always done the thing where they're like, let me tell you about this apple and why we love it. And I mean, I fall for it every time. I'm like, that just sounds amazing. Thank you for this recommendation. So definitely works. Yeah.
Switching back kind of over to thinking of the science of it. So looking at the future of, the shopping experience. But if we go back and look at the future of the science, what do you see as some of the biggest opportunities for innovation in measuring consumer sentiment and behavior in the grocery store space? What are those things that brands and researchers can do to kind of stay ahead of the curve when it comes to tech and consumer preferences evolving so quickly?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I think there is a lot of opportunity in is longitudinal measurements and what kind of happens outside of the grocery store, because I think it's easy to kind of just, because you have this purchase data, you have what's happening in the store, you're trying different promotional things. But ultimately, when grocery store shopping as a behavior is something that fits into a broader scheme of things in our life, and you're building a list, right? So like, do you have a smart home device that you can kind of support that with? What are you doing to help building the list easier? Going back to like the idea of decision fatigue, and can we make that easier for people to just shop, not just while they're in a store, but before they get to the store? And then what happens afterwards? So like measurements, I think diary studies is one of my favorite methodologies to use in grocery, because as much as I like the shop along or surveys, I think it just being able to capture that full picture and the repeated picture. And you oftentimes find like there's just that timeline of things. And I think that's just kind of been a general theme in like the way that I've done research, going back to like the aesthetics research is like, I think let's look at things over time. Let's add that time dimension. So I think that's definitely the biggest area for innovation. And you can expand that into, there's some really interesting companies out there that will, like if you have a product, you can kind of attach a sensor to it, for example, and you can see how people are using it. So like you can kind of see over time, like what had actually happened, things that generally end up being invisible. And we spent a lot of money and time on, and maybe we're in the wrong, but just a little bit of investment in getting beyond that. I also think that we could be a lot better with elicitation in the store, right? So like some of the ways that we generally, and I mean, we as like a retail industry, like you have a simple, like, are we doing great or not? I have a survey button, or you can respond through your receipt. But I think as it's becoming easier and easier to process and record qualitative feedback, just being able to kind of capture that a little bit more easier. And I think people have a lot of opinions, and we tend to get biased opinions or extreme opinions. So like just capturing that in general, and you hear that from your friends, and I think so that's what tells you that, like, clearly people are opinionated, but we're not capturing that. So we're definitely missing, and I think that's just a general consumer level, like, are we capturing everything? Are we just capturing when people are upset or really happy? So can we bring in those things? And as we move into more and more personalized purchasing, I think that becomes really interesting, because then you can understand, like, why didn't this person like it? And can we understand the consumer segment more, as opposed to just knowing this was bad, this was good?
Makes a lot of sense. Do you guys ever do like just straight up intercept research where you catch people on their way out and ask those questions? And then, because I'm just thinking you don't have as biased a sample, right? It's not the people who are wildly unhappy or happy. You're also getting the in-betweens as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's essentially the best analog of like what would be great if we could just do that all the time, like an intercept AI moderator or something. But yes, that is one of like the primary methodologies, because that's not biased. It's relatively easy to do in terms of like you don't have to recruit people, and it's in the moment. So there's a lot of things to like about it. And then it gives you like the first pass of like, okay, we're seeing something here. Let's dig into it more by like shopping along with people or doing more of a follow-up study or looking into the analytics there. But yeah, groceries, like intercepts are the bread and butter.
That makes a ton of sense. I really had not used that kind of methodology much until I had an airport study once. And I was like, I don't know how we're going to do this. And then I was like, wait a minute, captive audience. Like, they're all here. All we have to do is go there and talk to them.
And people love to share. That's the thing, right? I think it's like, but they would never share that otherwise. Like, a lot of people just don't know, or they don't want to fill out a survey, but you just need to stop them, and then you kind of just wait, and they will share as much as, like you want to hear.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Hassan, this has been super interesting today, getting to talk to you about all of these fascinating methodologies. And then also just the retail, I find in grocery context, is just really interesting. So appreciate the time. As we start to wrap up, there's a question, and if you've listened to the podcast, you know that we always like to ask. In your case, let's think about like folks who are just starting out in the world of consumer insights, maybe particularly in retail, who are interested in exploring some of these more advanced or unique approaches. What advice would you give them in terms of learning more about the application of behavioral science and advanced analytics? Does everybody need to get a PhD to do this kind of research?
I get that question a lot from just colleagues or friends that are like, oh, it's a complicated question because it's so hard to come up with the counterfactual. But my short answer is, no, absolutely, you do not need a PhD. And I think there is first principle things that you do learn from just like diving into the literature. But I think generally it's about interest. And I think that, like I mentioned, like I've always kind of felt that like I'm noticing these things and the curiosity that you have. So like it's more so, do you find yourself curious about these things? Is that something that stands out to you, or do you have to force yourself to think about, behaviors in the retail setting or behaviors or analytics? Do you wonder how a grocery store is doing based on a promotion that they put out, right? And if you have that level of curiosity, that is the only thing that you need, because anything else, you could go to school and you can kind of get sidetracked by some really, really interesting things. But if you don't come back with that curiosity, ultimately, it's not going to help you in that setting. It might help you in the academic setting or other settings. But I think the fundamental thing I'll say is just kind of like a self-reflection of like, is this something I just like, burning question, like, am I really curious about like how this is doing, or like, what are they trying to do here? I want to talk to the manager to understand, like, if you find yourself thinking like that, and I think you're kind of in the right space for, that's the kind of curiosity and passion you need to do well. And just everything kind of from there aligns, because the questions kind of lead the way. There's always the what is so abundant when it comes to the retail world. You have tons of data. You can split it in different ways, and you can measure behavior in different ways. And so it's more so like, the curiosity behind it.
Excellent. Makes so much sense. Well, again, we are so grateful for your time today. This has been fascinating, and we appreciate you coming on the podcast. The Curiosity Current is brought to you by AYTM. To find out how AYTM helps brands connect with consumers and bring insights to life, visit AYTM.com. And to make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the Curiosity Current on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.